and they're right here in St. Paul, Minnesota, for those of you who are local. At the end of the presentation today, I'll be sharing some information about 2 upcoming learning opportunities in business architecture in case you're interested. The other note I'll make is, in addition to kind of classroom training, they also provide customized training. And so quite often they'll do specialized on-site corporate training. And so if your company is interested in doing something like that, you can reach out via the website, complete a form, and someone will get back to you on that. Also call out, I am one of 4 business architecture instructors at IPD. All of us are practicing business architects, which I think is important. And with that, let's get things started here. So my name is Dean Heltemes. I am an instructor at Metro State. And in my spare time, my day job is I'm a senior director of business architecture at Ameriprise Financial. And so today we're going to be talking about how in these uncertain times, business architects can play an important critical role in helping their companies navigate through this complexity. So on screen, you'll see some of my background. I've been in IT for quite a while. I'll say over the last 10 years or so, most of those have been in architectural roles, and my passion really is business architecture. And so happy to be with you here today. So the objectives today really are to kind of share with you my kind of view of what's going on out in the world, really from a kind of an architect's viewpoint. And then really to kind of share some tools that you can use to help guide tactical and strategic decision making in such a dynamic environment. And I think, as you all realize, your business architectures will be changing. So how can you prepare for that? As an introduction, if you're like me, you've probably learned a whole new dictionary of terms over the last few months. I still find it mind-boggling that it's only been about 2 months like this. I see many of you on video are like me, working from home. I haven't been my home since early March. In fact, I haven't been in a retail store in that entire time. And so with that, there's just a lot going on. And so, beyond just the obvious pandemic and the impacts of it, there's just whole new ways of working, right? The shelter-in-place orders that are in place are causing all of us to just have to work differently. And so what we used to take for granted, doing calls like this, now are becoming really the norm. And with so much going on, I think sometimes we all feel like this, right? You can get pretty frazzled pretty easily. And so when you try to think about what you do as business architects, how can you bring some sense to this chaos? And I think the most important thing to consider is that in uncertain times, it's really important to stay focused on the future. And so, in the early days of what was going on, if you're like me, you probably were glued to the TV, glued to your phones, seeing everything that's going on, and that's important. But especially now that things are starting to change, it's really critical that you think about what's going to go on in the future, and that's really important as business architects because if you think about what business architects do, it's all about aligning strategic objectives and tactical demands. And so I always like to think that, these times are really where, folks like business architects are really uniquely positioned to help their firms navigate and really inform critical decision-making. Right now, firms are making big decisions every single day. And sometimes I'm not sure how informed people are when they're making those decisions. So now is a great time for you to step up and help your firms through these difficult times. So as an introduction, I'm going to start with the uncertain future, and I'm going to categorize it kind of in short, mid, and long-term outlooks. The short-term and the midterm stuff is stuff that's going on right now. So I'm not going to focus too much on that when we really get into kind of business architecture tools, because a lot of that's just going on right now. And I'll focus more on that long-term outlook. But I think it is important to really take a look at, how have we adapted today and what has been the impact on our industries? So the first thing is, obviously we already talked about, the majority of us are working from home. we all have probably children who are taking school from home. So in my particular case, I have a college student who, you know, suddenly had to come home and is now finishing. Today's her last day of college at Iowa State, doing it online. And so that's been an interesting experience. I have a middle school and high school age kids. They're all, you know, now working online. I've actually been amazed at how well it's actually quite working. Even attending church services from home. So that all happened really, really quickly. And so it's been amazing to watch. I think we're all living that today. Now, shopping online isn't new. I think we've all been doing that for quite a while. And Amazon in particular obviously has you know, done quite well with that. I think what's different now is, you know, we're doing almost all of our shopping online. As I mentioned, I've not actually stepped foot in a store in probably 2 months. And the reason for that is that we've found that we can pretty much get everything we want either shipped to our house or available via pickup, right? So a couple of good examples there. You know, I used to order quite a bit online, but I never would have ordered food before. Well, guess what? You know, almost every day of the week we have food coming and arriving on our door. We've actually subscribed to a milkman service. Believe it or not, those still exist. We have dairy products showing up on our doorstep once a week. And there's even places that, you know, historically haven't done some of this stuff. So local greenhouses and others where now all of a sudden they have a web presence. So it's gone from something that was a big deal to now it's pervasive, it's everywhere. And so that's definitely going to you know, shape the future of what all of our industries are gonna look like. Things like increasing cooking at home. All of a sudden, you know, there's less opportunity to go out, and you know, that's certainly had a lot of impacts. Reduced travel, that's a huge one, both from a entertainment perspective and recreational, but also just from a business perspective. So many of you might have the same experience as me. About 3 days prior to our spring break trip down to Orlando and Disney World, we received the announcement that it was closing. And so we had to frantically cancel our travel plans. So now we're all sitting with, you know, vouchers and, you know, unused tickets. And so that's had a dramatic impact on our personal lives, but also on the airlines. And obviously we'll cover a little bit more on many of the hospitality industries. Overall, reduced discretionary purchases. You know, people are holding off on a lot of things they might have done in the past. And another one is just the deferring of non-critical medical procedures. And so if you think about dentists and routine office visits, those just really aren't happening much at all right now. And so again, major impacts on everybody. So one of the things I think it's important to understand is that everybody's in a different place, right? Every industry is being impacted by this pandemic very differently. And so I'll share with you some statistics. So if you look at the most immediately impacted industries, really organized by how many employees they have, it presents an interesting view. So by far in the US, food services and drinking establishments make up, looks like, you know, almost 9.8 million employed workers. And I think, as you all know, you know, significant impacts, and that's a huge number of people that you know, are having to work differently. You know, whether it's, you know, people being furloughed, people being laid off, or those establishments trying to frantically come up with ways to still kind of keep their business model alive. Certainly, general merchandise stores, personal services such as haircuts. I haven't had a haircut myself in about 2 months, and so if you're like me, sometimes you keep the video shut off. But that's all. I mean, if you think about the impact to workers, it's huge. And then on top of that, you know, also represented in hugely impacted industries, not from an employee account, but just from a financial impact, airlines, right? We all know airlines are really struggling, and their outlook is tough. Travel and tourism in general. And another big one is oil and gas, right? It's kind of fun to see the low costs of gas today, except we're not going anywhere, right? So that industry is being hard hit as well. Mining is another big one financially. And so again, think about, that no matter what situation you're in, there are other industries out there that are probably being hit as hard or harder than yours might be. Now, on the bright side, not everybody is struggling, right? So e-commerce growth is definitely through the roof. So online retail sectors in the month of March were up 74%. And if you look at what makes that up, it's kind of interesting, right? So home products and furnishings, do-it-yourself products, garden essentials. So what's causing this? Well, we're all at home and we really don't have a lot to do, right? So I'm used to being extremely busy this time of the year, attending kids events, doing things, right? And most of my nights are going on. So what do? Apparently, we refurnish our homes, we fix things around the house, we plant gardens. In my personal experience, we're doing all those things, way more. I always joke, I think I've cleaned every junk drawer in my house, and I've fixed things that weren't broken. But from an online retail sector perspective, that's showing some huge growth for them. Another interesting one is online gaming, up almost 100%. So obviously not everybody's being overly productive, and their online gaming is definitely seeing some huge uplifts from this what's going on here. Of course, online doesn't protect you from the facts that if you're going online to buy physical things that are impacted, things like buying tickets to events, or traveling, or online dating is an interesting one. Those certainly are down as well. So again, think about not just your current situation, but the situation that all of your partners, all of your competitors, as well as all of us in our personal lives. There's just a lot going on, and your mileage will vary based on kind of what's going on, what's open, what's not. With that, let's shift to midterm. So those are all the things we're all doing today. Midterm is kind of right now, right? In most states, they're starting to look at relaxing, some of the restrictions, or opening up the economy, as they like to say, whatever that means. And so all companies are really doing some of the things I've got listed here on this page. And I think the number one most important thing that I see all firms doing, and the research has justified, is ensuring workplace safety. And why? Because obviously employees are the most important asset to any firm. And so if your employees don't feel safe in the environments they're working in, then they're not going to do a good job and or come back. And so kind of the best practice here is continuous engagement. And I hope your firms are doing as good a job as I think my firm is, and what I've seen elsewhere, where I get multiple times a week updates on my firm's perspective on what's going on, specific messaging around my workplace and kind of what's happening, what things might look like in the future, and ideas of when we might actually be able to go back to work. But that continuous engagement is important because now that we've been doing this for 2 months, it's really not that easy just to switch back. And if people don't feel safe, they're not going to. A second item that every company is really looking at is shoring up their supply chain. This, as I showed on the previous slides, every aspect of every industry really is being hit, and so supply chain vulnerabilities really have popped up here. So there's been some obvious ones in the news. Everyone's favorite, run on toilet paper. So certainly no one would have predicted that. Companies were turning out toilet paper as fast as they could, and now I think largely they're catching up. But as a retailer, as a company that produces this, what can you do to be able to adapt when situations like this arise a bit better? Another one that's going on right now is the meat industry. As you've heard, it's been pretty hard hit. Facilities with large numbers of workers, where the majority of those workers are being diagnosed. So many of them have shut down. And so the meat supply is already starting to be impacted. And so again, when you think about your supply chain, if companies like that are part of it, you need to be aware of what's going on and preparing for that. And so, conducting end-to-end supply chain risk assessments, and really looking at your base of suppliers and the channels that you go through, and diversifying there it's important. And now especially too, there are some new options, which I'll talk about coming up, where you might be able to find some new suppliers than you've been able to tap into in the past. So it's certainly a unique time, but a good time to take a deep look at your supply chain. Adapting your business continuity plan, another obvious one. At this point, if you're here, your business continuity plan probably is working to some extent, and your teams probably have been largely focused on improving that. And so you heard a lot of stories early on about companies that just were not able to extremely quickly get their workforce working from home. And so it's certainly more than that. I spend 8 to 10 hours a day on with my headset on, whether it's on Skype calls, WebEx calls, Zoom calls, and we've spent a lot of time already at my company just getting that better, working with our vendors to get that cleaned up and working better, making sure our employees have access to systems that maybe previously they never accessed remotely. And so there's a lot of things you can do in your business continuity plan to recognize the things that you might need to put in place that are going to be needed for both a mid and longer term that you might not have expected, and focusing on remote worker improvements clearly is something everyone should be looking at right now. Another huge topic is implementing crowd-friendly designs. And so obviously with the advent of social distancing, everyone needs to be careful from, the last thing you want is to be on the cover of the newspaper where your customers are getting sick. And so, what a lot of stores are doing is, limiting customers, right? There's a number of retail outlets that have limited the number of people they will physically allow in the store, and now they have to monitor that. Increased spacing we've all seen, right? Whether that's putting markings on the floors so people know what 6 feet apart looks like, putting more parking in, and then of course cleaning and sanitizing, right? So again, no one wants to make their customers sick, and so putting more rigorous sanitizing processes in place is certainly underway already. And for companies that have been closed for a while, that's largely what they're working on right now, is figuring that out. Good example is, if you've been reading, Starbucks as an example has a plan to open roughly 85% of their stores by the end of May, pending, other restrictions being lifted. And so, of course, one of the things they're talking about is how do they keep their employees safe, and how do they accommodate, crowd-friendly designs to still be able to get the coffee to the people who want it. So the biggest ones here are really, things like restaurants and movie theaters. Gyms is an interesting one, but even airlines, right? How many of you are ready to kind of jump up and jump on a plane, and sit in the middle seat between a bunch of people, right? Clearly, I'm not. And so even thinking about how airlines are going to start seating people to be able to provide some distance, it's a major impact. Thing people are going to need to be thinking about right now in this time where restrictions are slowly being lifted. All right, preparing for the surge from pent-up demand. So I talked already a little bit about, there have been things that are just being put on hold. So, most dentists, have been closed. A lot of personal care, like getting your hair cut, it's closed. Well, at some point, probably in the coming weeks, that'll start to open up. And guess what? Everyone is behind, right? Everyone needs to get their hair cut. Everyone needs to catch up on, their dental appointments. Maybe you've got medical procedures you've been putting off. All of those, there's going to be a huge, surge. And are you ready for that, right? You may already have staffing concerns working in this kind of environment. So do you have the resources to even deal with that? Especially then, how do you also accommodate that surge with crowd-friendly designs? Do you have online scheduling tools? Are you reliant on people calling in? And can you even deal with that influx? So I think every company to some extent needs to think about that pent-up demand that might be out there, and think about what they need to do to help prepare for that. And then kind of as a transition between mid and long term, really looking at your business plans and starting to reflect these changes you see in the marketplace. Again, most companies have been doing this a little bit more tactically, but certainly, looking at whether or not their business model will stand the test of time, or whether or not they have or will need to pivot their operations toward new products. That's a key activity that people are looking at now. And with that, I'll transition then to long term. I'll also mention I will pause for online questions in about in a few minutes here. So if you do have any questions you'd like me to cover in the middle here, just fire them into the Zoom group chat. I'll cover them then. And then at the end of the session, we will have a Q&A time where we'll take both verbal and online questions. Okay, so what is the long-term outlook? Well, I wish I could sit here today and say I've got it all figured out. But clearly no one's got this crystal ball, and certainly no one believes that it's going to look like the graphic on the screen here. But what I will do is share just some things that I've seen in my research and in my own daily observations. So you hear this talked about as the new normal. I'm not a huge fan of that phrase, but I think it does, I guess, represent that the idea of the way things were in, say, January, it may never look like that again, right? And so, some of the things I show on the screen here, I think are realistically going to be part of that new normal. Businesses really considering whether or not their full occupancy can ever be achieved again, and restaurants needing to have more crowd-friendly designs. Sports, I think it's going to be a long time before we see a stadium full of fans. So there's already a lot of talk about sports teams coming back and actually having games, but to an empty stadium, so we can all view it online. Whether it's working from home, cooking from home, that's not going to go back to probably the same volumes. Going back into the office, it certainly isn't going to be the same volume it was in the past. I'll be curious to see what education does, shopping from home, all this stuff that now has become kind of part of the way we work. I think it's pretty unlikely it's going to go back to the way it was before. And so what is the post-virus business landscape going to look like? I think some considerations to think about as you look at what your firm does. Number one is, what happens if people get really used to these at-home options and they don't come back, right? So, examples, people aren't going to gyms right now. They're working out at home. I think it's been quite creative to see how companies have, said, if you can't come in, I'm going to put some online training for you. I know in my family, I've got some of my family members who are, regularly joining some fitness sessions that were set up online. But clearly that's not then you're competing against free videos that are on YouTube. So, so will everybody come back? Going to movies versus streaming services, shopping online. Clearly people are learning, including myself, that I can order a shrub online and it can show up at my doorstep. And if that works well, my likelihood to go out to a store and buy one is probably lower than it was in the past. So I think it's important to really think about the reality of people may not come back, or certainly not to the volumes that we were seeing previously. Another one is universities, right? So universities are in a tough place right now. Many of them were already, operating, at either low margins or at a loss. And so if you think about what universities are going through, what are they going to do for the fall, right? So it's one thing that my daughter at Iowa State, completed her last semester from home for about 8 weeks, right? But what happens when Iowa State sends us the message that says, in the fall, we're going to do another, remote only, you can't come on campus? I'll tell you, my interest in paying a higher tuition rate, especially being an outstate tuition rate, isn't what it was when she was able to go on campus and have that experience. If I had a kid going to a private school and now all of a sudden they're telling me, you have to do this from home, I probably wouldn't do it. I know, friends of my daughters who have even said that if it comes to them doing another semester remote, they're going to drop out for a semester. Well, what is that going to do to colleges? I think there's many colleges who wouldn't be able to withstand that. So I think it's very important that people think about that reality of what happens if you need to extend kind of that current state of the way you're doing things. People may not be willing to do that long term. Will entertainment venue attendance ever get back to what it was before? So I think sports is an easy one, but add to that casinos, museums, parks, theaters. Those are all venues that a lot of times are built to require a certain capacity of attendance, to make their profit margin. And if those volumes go down, especially if they go down significantly, that's certainly going to be a challenge. When are people going to travel again? That certainly is a big question, and I'm not even going to guess at that one. I certainly don't have any travel plans. My company has already stated, travel right now is still on full lockdown for an extended period of time. So we'll have to watch and learn all together. Here's one to think about: long-term care facilities. So I don't think there's been any facility harder hit than long-term care. I think you've seen that from a number of people infected, and certainly more so the number of fatalities. It's the biggest risk area, and so it's a problem now, right? So certainly it's a huge issue now for them, and they're struggling to deal with the emotional tragedies of everyday life as they're going through this. But what happens in the future? Will people change their strategies on long-term care? So I'll give you an example, right? How open are you right now to go out and buying long-term care insurance on yourself or your parents or something like that? I'm certainly not. I mean, I'm kind of nervous to see even what happens in that industry. What if you were considering in the next year getting your loved ones into a long-term care facility? Well, again, I certainly wouldn't be doing that right now until I see some kind of idea that things are going to change. And so, not only is that an impact to the industries that surround long-term care, but now it's an impact to all of us. Because now, instead of having someone help you, you may be doing that yourself. And next thing you know, you're caring for your elderly parents on your own at your house or at theirs. And now you're trying to do that in addition to working. And so there could be some dramatic impacts on all of us until long-term care kind of figures out a way to handle where we're at and where things are going in the future. Needless to say, how will healthcare need to change in the future? I'm not going to touch that one. I think I'm sure there's many of you on the phone here that work in healthcare. That's going to be a really, really tricky one, both in terms of what we're learning from being able to do things online, but how do you prepare for and handle pandemics in the future? It's certainly a very, very tricky area. And finally, manufacturing companies. So there's a lot of interesting things that have happened recently where companies were able to quickly pivot, right, and start producing alternate products to help. So I think you've all heard examples of things like folks in the apparel industry being able to suddenly switch some of their lines to start producing masks and gowns. Or liquor companies who now are able to churn out hand sanitizer. So that's great, right? And it's super helpful for the current situation, but clearly that's not something that's probably going to be sustainable in their current business model. So when do you go back, or do you go back, or do you come up with a new product set? Interesting decisions that all companies need to kind of consider as they look forward. Okay, so before I dive into the second part, I'll take a couple of the online questions that have arrived. And again, if you've got any, please dump them into the chat window. One person, Sarah, also commented on the Disney World cancellations, and yeah, so I feel for you. And again, it goes back to my surge concept, right? Of I've got tickets, I've got airline tickets as well. That I need to use at some point. And so it'll be curious to kind of see how things open up and when, and then how we all get out there and start using those. Another question out here was around my thoughts on, scaling business architecture, short, mid, and long term. And so I think, that's a great question. So a little bit of thought on that. I think one of the things I have seen is, if you didn't know, online gaming is a huge industry. and I'm not going to try to quote the figures, but it also has huge attendance. It's actually one of the most attended types of sports, if you want to call it that, out there. So there's a whole industry around watching people, compete at these online games. And so, what's interesting is I have seen some of these sports teams actually start putting out some, even some fun things where they've got, team players who are, actually playing each other in online games and showing it on, and you can watch it. And so I do think sports teams tend to be pretty innovative, and I do see them looking at some options, right? So certainly they're going to try to get back on the courts and on the fields as soon as possible. But I think they do need to recognize and will that in that mid to long term, they need to come up with other ways to get revenue. And certainly online is one way to do it. So getting back on the field, being able to still show a product and get some of the revenue from those forums is important. But honestly, they're also going to have to look at other venues. And I think online gaming is one way to go with that, or even just other online productions that are a little bit safer than having to rely on crowd and attendance. Another question that just popped in, and I'll stop after this one to continue on, is opportunities to adapt and merge health industries given COVID might continue. I think that's a very good thought there, Dan. I think there is value in having all these niche and unique industries within health out there to do these different things. But I think when you put it all together and need to react to something like this, it's certainly, the challenge is exposed at a higher level. I am actually surprised at, in some ways, how well companies have been able to work across this, but I do think that there will be some unique opportunities coming up for health companies, and I'll actually talk about that a little bit in my business architecture section coming up. Okay, well, thank you for those questions, and let me carry on. So, as business architects, what are we supposed to do in the middle of this? And my answer is lead, right? I think we have the knowledge set and the toolbox of tools to help in times like this. So I'm going to cover 3 today. First one will be talking about your business model and potential business model transformations that you could look at. Our old friend, business capability assessments. And then another one that I'm sure we're all helping with, which is looking at our current project and investment portfolios and doing a review. Now is a perfect time to reassess your business model, right? No matter where you're at, whether you're doing okay, through this pandemic, or if you're one of those industries I shared before that is really struggling, now's the time to do it, right? Don't wait for your next annual planning cycle. Now's the time to jump in. And really, there's 3 major things you should be looking at. Number one is, even if you're doing okay, what can you do to make your current business model more resilient to things like this in the future? Second is will your business model even survive, right? This is back to really thinking about the new normal and trying to decide whether or not you need to make some changes there. Or do you need to pivot? In my examples of, do you need to look at your capabilities and potentially look at building new products or different channels? So how do you go about doing a business model review? For this, I'll fall back on a business architect's best friend, which is some of the tools that come from the company strategizer. So I'm sure many of you have used the business model canvas in the past or currently. The business model canvas is a great tool, a simple tool for documenting your business model. But it's also a really great tool for thinking about alternative future state business models to help identify some of those changes that you need to make. The other thing I'll call out is that maybe less known is that Strategizer has a number of other tools available. So if you haven't seen these, just check out their website. Most of these are freely downloadable. And one of these I've got a snapshot on the screen for is an assessment question for leaders you can use in times like this to really do a pulse check on how they're thinking about things right now. And so as you're looking at potentially helping, with a business model review, I think some of these assessments that they have available are great tools for that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to pop open a bigger version of the business model canvas, and I'm going to just share with you some examples that I've actually found, that are happening and have happened actually in the last 6 weeks in most cases. So the first one I'll talk about is where a company's really can look at key partners differently. And so maybe you've seen, but obviously most airlines have planes grounded. And so certainly that's not good. They have a lot of fixed capital costs, and so they need their planes flying. And so what have some airlines done? They've started offering cargo flights. They've done this in the past, actually, with other crises. But now in particular, if you think about how much UPS and the Postal Service, how much product is being shipped, they're a lot of cases they're out of capacity. And so if you are in the business of needing to ship product, you and maybe have had some challenges, here's a new outlet you can take a look at. There are new partners you can take a look at in shipping that you may not have had available before. Of course, you need to consider, is that in the short term or long term, but either way, it's just a new consideration. When you think about the key resources you need to deliver your value statement, when you need to pivot and do things differently, you probably need to make some changes to your resources. So a good example here is curbside pickup. And so curbside pickup, it's not a new concept, but it has changed dramatically over the last 3 months. And so in the old days, you'd probably always see restaurants having the ability to have a couple stalls where you can pull up, order ahead of time, and you can either go in and get the food, or in some cases they may bring it out to you. That's taken on a whole new world. So I don't know how many of you have done this, but it's actually quite impressive. I'll give you, one really good example is the experience I had at Walmart. So Walmart, we've been able to go online, place an order, and reserve a pickup time, usually out several days. The first time I drove to Walmart, as soon as I reached the parking lot, there were bright orange signs directing you where to go. Okay, so I was able to easily follow those because I had no idea where to go. It brought me to the side of the building, and there were well-marked spots where I needed to park. And when I parked, there was a sign that actually said exactly what I needed to do. It gave me a phone number. I called it. They asked me the questions. I sat there. They came out. Touch-free. They put everything in the back. They were all wearing masks and gloves, and I never had to leave the vehicle, and I never needed to actually talk to anyone. It was brilliant. Well, think about the resources they needed to put that in place. These are things they didn't have prior to this, right? So they had to add a whole bunch of parking spaces. They had to add the capability to have employees go pick product from throughout the store and then wheel that out, right, to vehicles. They needed to buy masks. They needed to buy gloves. They need their online systems needed to be probably ramped up. And so a lot of resource changes needed to be made. And so clearly that's something they've made short term, but more than likely, I'd say they're probably going to keep some of that moving into the future. Another example of key activities changing, right? So if you think about restaurants, right, they have their normal key activities of serving customers, but I saw an interesting one where restaurants, in some restaurants are actually now entering the grocery market. Why? Because they can't sustain themselves on takeout orders. And they have, where retail stores may have problems keeping a certain product on the shelf, quite often restaurants don't, because they source that differently in different volumes. And so, they found they had stuff sitting on the shelf that, would either, die or, they'd have to just start ramping down on their orders. Some have found that they can actually sell that. And so, it's just a unique new market they can enter. Not sure if they do that long term, but at the same time, it is kind of a new key activity they were able to quickly adapt and implement. Fitness companies moving workouts online. And so if you think about the value proposition of a gym, right? Boy, has that been changed, right? In terms of what's happening where people can't go to gyms. And so putting workouts online, now those gyms have to come up with a value statement for why you should keep working with them and paying them, even if you can't go into their facility, both now and potentially into the future. Stores expanding digital offerings, it's an obvious one. In terms of what customer segments you serve, I saw an interesting one where Mattel came out with a new line of toys honoring essential workers, right? So it's for nurses and doctors and delivery people. And clearly they're not, just targeting kids for these. They see this as kind of a noble product honoring, what these frontline workers are doing. And so that's not a market they probably would have gone after before. But, it's just an example where you can look at, what you do and potentially pursue both short and longer term, different segments than you may have considered before. And then another one I'll talk about is hotels, right? So hotels are empty. Most people aren't traveling. And so some hotels are now offering day rates for working from home employees. And so if you think about, why that's important, on a day like today where I'm online, sitting from home, with a bunch of people online, I'm certainly concerned that, my family is going to come running in and start making noise, or my lousy 2 megabit per second DSL connection is going to drop. Boy, they'd been nice to, spend $30 and go in a hotel room that I feel was properly sanitized, has super fast Wi-Fi, and best yet, peace and quiet. And so I thought that was a creative idea too of going after a different customer segment. One final example in this section is just thinking about something much more transformational in your business model. So I think we've all seen that, conferences have taken a big hit. So when you think about something like the Salesforce Dreamforce conference, which is one of the biggest conferences in the world, that event drives a ton of things for Salesforce. So the idea of just not having them is pretty traumatic. And so there's a few companies out there that are really looking at building something new. So we've all probably been to, broad online experiences, but when you think about having tens of thousands of people participating in something compelling and collaborative, I've never seen that. And I think any company that is able to pull something together like that, I think is going to have a winner. So the first entry in this market space, and maybe the fast follower, definitely I think is going to have a winning product. And what's interesting here is conferences are actually $1 trillion industry. And so all of a sudden, this has exposed kind of a gap that has really no one's ever cared about, but now there's this huge opportunity. So certainly think about, something more transformational, think big, because there are some of those opportunities popping up out there. For business capability assessments, this is obviously one of the big standard tools that business architects like to use. And so when you're thinking about the long-term impacts of the pandemic, pretty standard stuff, right? Are there new capabilities I need? Which capabilities that I have are going to need additional investment? And then honestly, what existing capabilities are now a lower priority? So if you've been doing your job, hopefully you've got a heat map that already kind of talks about the current state of your capabilities. If not, it's a great time to actually build one. And so what I'm going to do here is actually talk a little bit about how you can use your heat maps in different ways, right? So I think, traditionally when you're doing an assessment, you're either talking about maturity or performance, right? How well is that capability performing for your firm? But what I've shown here is, here's a couple different ways you can really think about it. So when I talk about which existing capabilities are now a lower priority, it's interesting to overlay that across, your map to kind of see, you may have a capability that had a ton of investment, but now you see, it's just not that important right now. Well, when we get to the piece about looking at your project portfolio, guess what? I think you've got some easy answers there. Now's a great time to revisit all the gray space on your map. Maybe there's capabilities you did not previously need, but now you do need. So calling those out is important. What capabilities suddenly require new investment? So that's an easy one. But a couple other ones to think about is, which capabilities are really being impacted by, this inability to do things face to face, right? Because that, could persist for a long time. And so that in and of itself could spawn some work to really dig in and find out what do you need to do differently in those capabilities to accommodate the fact that the new normal is not going to be the way it was. And finally, another kind of obvious one, which is some of these capabilities need to be technology enabled now, right? They're things that you literally can't get done or are getting done poorly, and that's where your tech investments need to go through. So getting things online, examples like that. All right, and then the final section, investment portfolio review. And so, we all have, investment portfolios or project portfolios. And so the tool I'm going to use here is really just the the start, stop, continue model. So I'm sure many of you have used this before. Quite often it's used really for team brainstorming, really to kind of look at strategies and how you're working. But I think it's also an effective way to kind of do a rapid assessment of your project portfolio. So the first thing I focus on is, what do we stop doing? I've already called out this a little bit, which is, anywhere where you have non-critical discretionary spend and you need funding to do something else, that's the prime opportunities. I'm sure many firms have already done this, right? They've already cut some things that they just know weren't that important. I will say, as business architects, though, we do need to help the firm think strategically. So the first thing is, think about the cost to restart. Sometimes people think restarting a project is free. I think we all know it's not, right? So if you put something on the shelf and then a year later start it again, all of that work you did leading up to that, a good portion of that may just be totally lost. You'll lose some of the resources, you'll lose certainly knowledge, things may have changed. So there is a cost in restarting a project that should be considered. A cost of delay. Maybe your firm was counting on an efficiency gain from something you were implementing. With that efficiency gain gone now, that's going to have a budget impact. Make sure people are considering that. And then, of course, the loss of potential revenue. If this was a project that was going to drive some top-line growth, obviously that is something firms are going to be looking for now. So just make sure that when people are looking at leveling the axe on some projects, that they're thinking about those things before they get cut off too quickly. When you think about what to start doing or accelerate, I think the first thing I'll call out is just that need to accelerate our analysis timelines. Right? I think most companies still have some form of annual, quarterly, or monthly planning and decision-making processes. In times like this, that's just clearly not enough, right? You don't want to wait for your next annual planning cycle to make some of these changes. And I'll even argue quarterly and monthly isn't enough. Every week, and sometimes daily, we're hearing news that's going to change the face of how our businesses operate. And so if you have not seen some of those meeting cadences change in terms of how you're reviewing and making these decisions, go talk to some of those folks and get that sped up. So let's talk about a few different things to consider starting, doing, or accelerating. The first one is just investing in new ways of serving your key stakeholders. I've talked about this throughout. Obviously, things like remote workforce enablement, but another one is automation, right? There's a lot of things we do for our customers and our employees that we have automated, but there's a lot of things we haven't. And so now might be a prime opportunity to say, we can't continue to struggle with people remotely trying to get these done. Let's invest in some automation and get that dependency, out of the way. Virtual products, right? So now's the time of virtual products, right? So if you had things you were considering, so looking at monetizing your knowledge or processes or developing actually software products, obviously now is a key time to double down on that and go after that, because again, things aren't going to go back as quickly as we probably hoped. And so those virtual products might become a key part of your profits in the future. Mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures. Some might find it funny that at a time like this that we even bring that up. But the simple fact is, buy low, sell high, right? So, valuations are very low on many companies right now. So aggressive companies look at times like this to be bold. It is an opportune time to invest. And I know there's many companies out there that are, scouring the markets, looking at, which companies are struggling right now. Which of them have capabilities that your firm could use that may not survive what's going on now? No better time than the present to go after, companies like that. I'll also say you may have a portion of your business that has been traditionally underperforming, and you do need to cut that now. And so I think you will see a number of companies looking to divest some of that dead weight that's been holding them down historically, but also even more so now. And then a fourth one is digital transformation. I love this graphic I saw, which, when you ask the question, who led the digital transformation at your company? Was it your CEO? Was it your CTO? Or was it COVID-19? And I think in many ways, the survey I've got up here actually mimics that, which is, I think the vast majority of companies out there are really looking at what's going on as an opportunity to accelerate the pace of their digital transformation. which makes a ton of sense. So where you've struggled in the past to get the funding, now it's no better time than the present to be able to demonstrate what happens when you don't have some of those digital capabilities you're looking for. So I think that is something I'm certainly seeing in my day-to-day life, but also seeing across the industries. All right, so with that, we've got a little bit of time left. So if you are interested in asking a verbal question, please go ahead and there is a clapping symbol that you can pop up in the window. Otherwise, and then from there we'll call on you. Otherwise, I will start to answer some of the questions that came in during the Zoom call. Here. Yep, just one comment from Beth on just as the business model pivots, acknowledging kind of those capabilities that need to change. I think there's plenty of companies out there who attempted to pivot and failed. Right, it's not as easy as many people think. So I can give two personal examples of that. One example is your experience when you go to get food. Right, let's say you ordered online and you go to do a pickup, which I do maybe once a week. And I've had some really good experiences where they're super organized and exactly what to do. But I've had some cases where I show up, the parking lot is full. There's one person running around with a phone to their ear and they literally can't tell who's who. So clearly they dove in, right, to try to pivot their model to a takeout pickup model, but clearly didn't have the capabilities in place. I think another one is, I talked about greenhouses, not a space that traditionally they've had much of an online presence, but certainly I've seen that starting to happen. I went to actually order some stuff for Mother's Day, and I found a site that had it. But the site was terrible. I mean, you could tell that it was cobbled together by someone who really didn't know what they were doing. They only had about 6 products online, and even just the UX experience was pretty traumatic. I was able to put the order in. I'm not all that confident that I'm actually going to get something. I hopefully I do, but I mean that's a clear example of think before you jump, right? And don't overassume that just because everyone's doing it, you can do it. And otherwise, what you risk is hurting your brand recognition. Because obviously, if you have a really bad experience even during these times, it may impact your willingness to go back. Another question that just came in was to go back to the capability slides. So I will do that right here. Again, if anyone wants a verbal question, just actually click anything to have it pop up in the window, and we'll call on you. So again, this is back to heat maps. This is actually just a generic visual I pulled from the BizBach guide. But most people who have a capability model have some form of a capability assessment and a heat map. So the BizBach has some really good examples. I'll also say that the Twin Cities Business Architecture Forum has some really good resources online. I will always reference my favorite one, which is from one of my friends and fellow instructors, Pat Solaski, which has a really nice and simple best practice for doing heat maps. So certainly would recommend you take a look at that, and certainly you can reach out to me offline if you're interested. So. All right, let me see if there's anything else popping up here. We got a few more floating in. Somebody asked a great question, which is what is the connection between capabilities in your investment roadmap? That will really be based on the maturity of business architecture at your company. So in my previous life at other companies and in doing some consulting, I've seen places that do this really, really well. So every project really is tied to what capabilities it is investing in and how it is improving them. And so if you've built those ties out and have those enabled in tools, doing something like I talk about here actually becomes quite easy. As soon as I flag a capability that now we want to lower the priority on investment in, I can simply switch into my project management tool and query based on what capabilities are being invested in. I'd say probably most companies don't have that. And so then it's probably a bit art and science of business architecture, enterprise architects, PMs, combing through. And I think it's relatively easy to kind of do a quick pass, depending on the size of your portfolio, to try to make those connections. Definitely, if you haven't made that connection in the past, something I'd highly recommend. It is, I think, a very powerful tool to be able to make those connections, especially if you keep your heat maps up to date. If you start using a tool like this more as part of your project planning processes. All right, with that, we are at the top of the hour. So again, thank you for your time. With that, I will quickly switch to my closing slide here. And I guess I can cover this. There's new opportunities coming up here. So there will be another webinar coming up. You'll see it is on June 3rd. So keep an eye out for that. We do have a boot camp session. We're watching the timing on this based on everything that's going on, but we do intend to continue to offer once or twice a year business architecture sessions at Metro State. You can always check out the website or call for more information, and certainly feel free to reach out to me via LinkedIn, and I'd be happy to connect. All right, everybody, thank you for your time. Stay safe and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.